Each week here on Fresh Outlook, we have brought in international experts to share their insights into the Ukraine crisis. Here's an update on this week's developments. Ukraine's foreign minister says operations against pro-Russian militants in the east of the country have been suspended over Easter, but will resume if the separatists continue to occupy government offices. Here's more on that story.
First Kiev, then Crimea, and now Luhansk. Ukrainians are taking to the streets in protest. Thousands of residents call for a united Ukraine, while they're drowned by a cacophony of secessionist demands.
We want very much that the people who are doing unlawful things in our city to go home to their families.
Pro-Russia militia have seized Regional Security Service headquarters and want a referendum on the federalization of Ukraine. In Slavyansk, some residents express faith in the pro-Russian forces controlling the Ukrainian town.
It is not important to me whether there is a Russian or a Ukrainian flag as long as I have something to eat.
Meanwhile, some Ukrainian military vehicles are manned by separatists after troops switched sides. The military setback leaves Kiev looking weak on the eve of the Geneva Peace Conference.
We have Dee Dee Benkie, Dr. Alex Mirescue from St. Peter's University, and Daniel Friedheim from Drexel University. He teaches history and politics and is also a former Foreign Service officer with the State Department and a first-timer here on Fresh Outlook. Lots of first-timers today.
Thanks.
So we're going to welcome you to the show, and we'll start off by talking about this week's developments. And just to summarize exactly what's happened, obviously they're saying that they're going to take a little Easter break, but we still see a lot of the pro-Russian forces in the government buildings.
Well, so there was a diplomatic agreement in Geneva between foreign ministers of the U.S. and Russia, and then Ukraine, and an EU representative too, agreeing to disarm illegal groups. But of course, like a lot of diplomatic agreements, the devil is in the detail, and it doesn't seem yet like either side can agree who's illegal and needs to disarm.
Well, that's one big question. Just from watching this, obviously they're saying little break in the action there, but come Monday morning, I don't think that Vladimir Putin is going to be changing his game hand.
No, I don't think he'll change his game or shuffle his cards much, in part because he doesn't need to at this point. Russia will ultimately score a minor victory. The Geneva talks are now talking about a federalization of the Ukraine that will effectively put a halt to the Ukraine's wider European and NATO aspirations, which was the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal of Russian foreign policy was not to seize the Crimea. It was simply to stall, confuse, freeze Ukraine's westward movement, and a federalization will then halt that, at least for like the next 10 or 20 years. So in a way, Putin doesn't have to make much changes. The only problem will be is, and the next few days are really key. Susan Rice was saying that the next few days will be quite key, mostly because it's going to be very difficult in any sort of ethnic conflict, and I saw this while I was working in Bosnia. It's very, very difficult to have large-scale players, regional players, control small people, small groups, armed, and in this case it might just take a few drunk guys with a couple Kalashnikovs to really destabilize.
Well, I think you got a little...
I think there are a lot of drunk guys over there, and they're Putin's guys, and they're Putin's, Putin's militia over there saying, okay, they're just these crazy people. We don't know who they are. Yeah, right, sure. Mr. KGB is going to continue to be Mr. KGB. And, you know, I think Senator McCain's right. He just calls the EU sanctions a joke. What we're doing is a joke. And he is actually traveling over with Senator Hoeven. I think the adults are finally going over to check out what's going on, because right now,
so the U.S. should militarily intervene?
I mean, well, I tell you what Senator McCain said, and I agree with him. He said, for God's sakes, can we at least give them some light weapons so they can defend themselves? I mean,
but they
really,
don't need light weapons.
What
they
are you
have
talking
them.
about? Okay, really? I mean, you know, you said before that Putin was not going to go further than Crimea, and he already has. And he's going to continue. You don't think he has military there? You don't think he has a presence in Ukraine?
The Russian military hasn't crossed the eastern border. Whether they're operatives is another thing.
Well, let's not forget that we're not getting the straight picture also. There's a lot of journalists that have not been over there.
That's true.
Let's hear from you.
I was just going to say, I thought it was very interesting. On exactly the same day, middle of this week, that the diplomats were sitting down in Geneva, that President Putin spent, I guess it was about 4 hours explaining himself to the country, and one little detail he got around to admitting was that he did have troops in Crimea in advance.
He just sort of added that little side.
But
Oh, by the way, I did
amazing
invade.
that he does these 4-hour Q&As? I find that amazing, but he won't have journalists. He'll kick the journalists out, but he'll do a 4-hour Q&A.
That he completely controls, of course, because that's what he does.
Now, of course, he says he doesn't have them in eastern Ukraine, but there are
They've already taken satellite pictures.
People jokingly call them,
that's already been confirmed that.
Well, the satellite pictures had one moment. There are 3 primary pre-existing Russian bases along the east. They're within 40 to 100 kilometers. They've been there during Soviet times.
But so they've actually set up shop there. They've been able
there for a long time. This is just a fact. I mean, it is not apologies for Putin. They're probably reinforcing these bases because let's also think, like, this is a destabilized Ukraine with something to the effect of 60 to 80,000 mobilized Ukrainian troops. So to expect that Russia would not at least somehow be prepared for some scenario would be a lack of any credibility of a military contingency that Russia likely has.
Now, I do want to ask Dr. Friedheim a quick question, because we've been just talking about this for the last couple of weeks. How do you think Russia is viewing our president right now?
Oh, I mean, they're
giggling, Dee Dee.
Okay, I'll keep my mouth shut. I am on this.
Insulting each other, aren't they? Right. A while back, President Obama said something like, President Putin sometimes looked like the bad boy sitting in the back of the classroom,
well, he
acting
happens to be the bad boy sitting in the back of the classroom.
And I think Putin is kind of returning that, I guess you could call it contempt, right? They now have pretty open contempt for each other. Now, they disagree about something really fundamental, which is whether there in this 21st century is any, President Obama has called it old-fashioned 19th or 20th century right to redraw international borders, and that's a serious disagreement. Right. I'd be interested in hearing, Alex, what you think about whether annexing the Crimea was an acceptable thing that the world is just going to get used to.
Well, there are hard borders and soft borders, and the Crimea in the Russians' eyes was probably a soft border that they could take, but that would be a discussion for another time, I think.
We've talked about why this U.S.-Russian relationship is so important, but as we go into this next week, it may be the most critical week that we've ever really been watching. What do you think is? I don't
think Putin cares. He doesn't care. He's going to do whatever he wants to do. He's moving on. He's moving forward. He's going to move as far as he possibly can. And the only way it's going to work is if Europe gets engaged. I mean, we know what United States, what we want. President Obama's being very weak on it. So I don't think it's going to get any better anytime soon.
What should both countries do to repair this relationship then?
Well, the relationship is perhaps not as damaged as people think it is. Firstly, this week there were also negotiations on the Iran nuclear plan. Russia's playing ball completely. They're playing ball.
We also had casualties this week too.
Fine.
A few casualties.
Fine, but if you look at the wider periphery of this relationship, the relationship is not about the Ukraine ultimately, but there are wider relationships. So Syria, Russia will continue to be a player in that. It doesn't seem like it's making any threats to the U.S. on pulling out its diplomatic influence. It's playing ball with Iran, with the exception of a few cheeky remarks by the Russian representative to the talks. Otherwise, they've made a fair amount of progress. Russia could have pulled out the 6-party talks in North Korea. It could have stalled its position on Syria, and it could have just completely gone against any American initiative against Iran, and that's not happening.
Well, we're going to be talking a little bit more about Russia because, of course, we're going to be talking about Edward Snowden in our third segment. So we are going to talk to switch topics though on this international segment and look at some of the other news from around the world. We're going to turn to South Korea, where the ferry tragedy has also focused new attention to the country's suicide epidemic. Kangmin Gai was the vice principal of the school where hundreds of students are still missing. He had been saved from the disaster, but this week, the 52-year-old man hanged himself. Now, in another country, Kang's death might be taken as an isolated incident, but in South Korea, it's hard to ignore. South Korea has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, more than double that of the United States. So it is hard to ignore this much broader crisis in this country. Any thoughts on this when you first heard about this? I was somewhat surprised. I know in the culture, I've been to South Korea several times, there's something about shame. But this is pretty incredible when you think about the numbers, double that of the U.S.
Yeah, this is definitely a cultural difference, a huge cultural difference, because as you say, shame, if someone feels shame, they feel like they need to kill themselves. I don't, as an American, I really just don't understand it. I think, you know, that's something that psychology just would have to address, but I just don't understand it at all.
They also have said it's something to do, possibly, they've looked at electronics and the way people are working inward, but many other countries have the same problem. So I just thought that was an interesting.
I mean, it's kind of like, what good does it do? If you kill yourself, what good does that do anyone? I don't understand that.
Well, if you're in that frame of mind, I guess we can't debate that. We'd have to get Dr. Bart
Dr.
on
Rossi.
that one. But any thoughts? Were you somewhat surprised when you heard that it was double?
I mean, I was surprised. I have come across the figure before. I was just surprised that the U.S. is, on second place, which seemed very high, or that the numbers were double the U.S. But
yeah, it strikes me it's a little bit of maybe an unfortunate cost of really successful economic development and pressure to obviously, through education, succeed in catapulting South Korea from, say, in 1960, one of the middle-ranking developing countries,
absolutely,
to now one of the top economies in the world.
Okay, no, the pressure is another reason that they cited, but obviously it's probably a combination of several different factors. And we also, of course, want to talk about the global search for the Malaysian Airlines jet. That continues, of course, and we've heard from many of our viewers who have asked this question: why wasn't GPS installed on the plane? Well, we interviewed an airline pilot, and we're told this: the tracking of airplanes is almost entirely radar-based, either commercial or military. Some planes have global position systems to help with navigation, but they are not tracked on the ground. Now, since Flight 370 went missing, many people have asked about GPS. Well, it is likely that tracking systems will be upgraded to ensure a plane is never lost again, but the question is, who will pay for that? And that is a question we will certainly debate and certainly talk about here on Fresh Outlook. Don't go away. We do have much more coming up on the show, including a look into how a high school dropout from the Maryland suburbs came to possess and expose secret NSA documents. We're talking, of course, about Edward Snowden, and we'll have much more on that when we come back.